I call the honourable member Carol Beaumont.
Thank you very much, Mr Chair. Rising to speak on Part 2 of the Victim Orders Against Violent Offenders Bill, and joining others in acknowledging this is a small but significant step forward and does fill a gap, and it will be in part recognising the ongoing effects of serious violent offending on victims by giving them the power to apply for a non-contact order. And Part 2, of course, is the part of the bill that actually puts that in place and provides the mechanisms and the substance to that of those provisions of non-contact orders. So the non-contact order has been, I think, significantly improved by the work of the Select Committee, and again, as others have, I want to acknowledge the fact that there is good cross-party support for this provision. And it does, I think, reflect a concern that many have about the types of violence and intimidation that do exist, and not solely but often used against women. And it has been good tonight to actually recognise across this House the understanding that there is about the problem of sexual violence, the fact that those that are victims and survivors of sexual violence often have extensive ongoing impacts of that violence, and in fact that, as I described earlier this evening, having listened to the submissions to the Social Service Select Committee inquiry, has been described as a very traumatic, ongoing series of impacts on health, on the ability to form relationships, and a whole range of substantive issues. And so this does provide assistance. I guess one concern I do have, and it's based on recent reflections on protection orders in domestic violence situations, is of course there does seem to be a concern about the enforceability, but also the way that breaches of protection orders have been allowed to happen almost with impunity in some cases, and we've seen some very significant consequences recently of that. So in establishing this new provision, I think we do need to make sure that looking at non-contact orders and what happens around breaching them and how that's actually implemented is going to be important for us. As others have said, those non-contact orders can relate to the offender entering defined areas, residing in specified areas, and working in specified areas. And some of this is about the potential for psychological abuse, not just physical abuse, by the fact that somebody who has taken such a significant and abhorrent action against another person, then essentially putting themselves in ongoing contact. So, as I say, that is good to see. I think that the reflection of others on what really we need for victims and better outcomes for victims and survivors of sexual violence is really important, particularly in terms of the criminal justice system. And this is one small thing, and the fact of the matter is we need a comprehensive look at this area for the reasons that have been articulated about the low level of convictions, the actual experience that victims of sexual violence face going through the court system and seeking to get justice. And so while these orders are useful, I think we shouldn't kid ourselves that there isn't a great deal more to do. And I have to say that the Minister of Justice, the current Minister of Justice, and we don't know how long she'll stay in that role, but the current Minister of Justice has brushed aside suggestions, really, of better responses, legal responses to sexual violence. In the letter to the Honourable Phil Goff, she refers, in fact, to a bill we dealt with earlier this evening, Victims of Crime Reform Bill. She talks about some of the provisions that are already in place and essentially says that some of the wider reforms that you might expect, and this bill that we're dealing with tonight around these non-contact orders could have been part of a wider set of reforms. The Law Commission's report on alternative trial processes all brushed aside. Now, it's quite clear to those working in the area that there's a significant number of reforms that need to be made that will start to deal with some of the low conviction rates and also some of the, Mr Chair.
The Honourable Member Carol Beaumont.
Thank you. Some of the brutalising and difficulties that people face in trying to get justice in this area. And you know, there are particularities around sexual violence that make it difficult. Evidential issues where there often are no other witnesses. But there are things that can be done about that. Prosecution guidelines about what needs to happen here, better support in court, safety in court. Issues around court delays actually is a problem in this area as well, because when it's a very emotionally intense process, as it is in sexual violence trials, delays, you know, can just really make it worse for that survivor. The adversarial process itself, and that's really what the Law Commission deals with, the lack of boundaries and some of the behaviours of defence lawyers.
I'm sorry to interrupt the Honourable Member. Honourable Members, the time has come for me to report progress.
The House is resumed. Mr Chairman.
Mr Speaker, the committee has further considered the Victims of Crime Reform Bill and reports it with amendment and divided into the following bills: the Victims' Rights Amendment Bill, Children and Young Persons and Their Families Amendment Bill number 4, Parole Amendment Bill number 2, Sentencing Amendment Bill number 2. Mr Speaker, the committee has also considered the Victims' Orders Against Violent Offenders Bill and reports progress. The committee reports no progress on the Vulnerable Children Bill. Mr Speaker, I move that the report be adopted.
The question is that the report be adopted. Those for that opinion will say aye. Contrary, no. The ayes have it. So the bills divided from the Victims of Crime Reform Bill are set down for third reading next sitting day, and the Victims' Orders Against Violent Offenders Bill and the Vulnerable Children Bill are set down for further consideration in committee next sitting day, and the House will be suspended until I resume the chair at 9 a.m. tomorrow morning for the extended sitting. Good evening, everybody.